For example, the situation in Ukraine, that you have a lot of countries, middle powers, whatever you want to call them, who are free riders on an international system that they benefit from but are not willing to defend when it's under threat. And I'm not singling out Pakistan. I'm not singling out any country.
The US led in the last 20 years have really damaged that credibility of the global system in the minds of people in this part of the world. Again, not making a judgment call, but Iraq, for instance, I think is a big mark.
The US media is like, the mainstream media is sort of like working with the CIA or the government, or that I get a call from Jeff Bezos or General Electric to tell me what to write. That's nonsense. That's ridiculous. That really doesn't happen. Nevertheless, there are examples.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Today, for this special edition podcast, I'm joined by former National Security Advisor Pakistan and Vice Chancellor Beaconhouse National University, Dr. Moeed Yusuf. And with us, our special guest is published author, columnist, and CNN analyst, Josh Rogin. Dr. Moeed and Josh, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
All right, Josh, let us go ahead and start our conversation with you first. You know, there's so much going on globally, from the Russia-Ukraine theater, the South China Sea, and climate disasters. Where do you both see the world headed in the next 10 years? Josh, we'll go with you first and then with Dr. Moeed.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this podcast. It's my privilege and honor to be with you today. You know, I have been covering foreign policy as a journalist in Washington, D.C. for about 20 years. And over that time, what I've seen is a steady sort of dysfunctional, functional state of U.S. foreign policy that has not worked the way exactly that we wanted it to, but generally overall has did well in sort of leading a sort of informal coalition of countries that believed in certain things, that enforced certain rules and pushed certain values and protected certain interests. It's complicated, but generally there was some consistency in that position here in America, is what I mean, on both sides of our political system. And of course, now in the last 5 years, that's all broken down. And what we have here in Washington is not only more dysfunction, but really more factionality, more separation, more distance and division in our politics and in our foreign policy. And I think that is mirrored in many Western European countries and some Eastern European countries, in the sense that the order that the establishment figures in both parties had built after the fall of the Soviet Union was fraying, and the globalization had failed to provide sufficiently for the people in a lot of democracies, and the rewards of globalization were not properly distributed, and therefore there was discontent, which fueled the rise of populism. And we saw that, of course, in the election of Donald Trump as our president. Now I see us entering into a new phase. And again, I'm just speaking from the Washington perspective, so I don't pretend to speak for peoples in other parts of the world. But I think we're entering a new phase where it's we're now having a response to that populism and a pushback. And that was most, of course, made clear by the election of Joe Biden, who was not a particularly electable president, except for the fact that Donald Trump performed so erratically as president, especially during the pandemic. So now we're entering into a new era. What will that era look like? I think it will be an era of American foreign policy being more constrained, actually, due to resources, due to a lack of consensus amongst the American people for a more interventionalist, more internationalist, more policy. I think it'll lead to less American economic power and less American ability to use that economic power in ways to advance both American and what America perceives as its enlightened self-interest, the self-interest of America as it relates to bringing the world into a more agreement and alignment along certain principles. And I think that this diffusion of power is certainly taking place, but the question remains about where it will go. And in Washington, we would rather it goes to those countries that share our interests and our values. First of all, our allies and partners. Second of all, our other free and open societies and democracies. Of course, there's another group of countries that would prefer that diffusion of power go to them. And here I'm talking about more of the dictatorships and monarchies and basic anti-Western, anti-imperialist focused regimes. And that game is what's being played now. I don't think we know how it's going to end. I would prefer that it end on the side of countries that believe in freedom and democracy and human rights and who want to work together to promote those shared interests and values and climate change and all of the rest. And I think that's an unsettled question, both here at home and around the world.
All right, Dr. Moeed, and if I can have your views on the same question as well.
Look, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. But I simply will put it to you that the world is a mess. And I think we're headed to more and more competition where cooperation is still rationally possible. You know, when you look at geopolitics and global geopolitics and fluid situations, basically the world is moving from a unipolar moment, I would say, because it only lasts about 30, 35 years, and gradually will shift into either bi or multipolarity. In these fluid situations, you're always going to have challenges and opportunities. And what I see right now is an unnecessarily fast-track process towards camp politics, where the big players, get embroiled in a purely competitive or largely competitive relationship, whereas overwhelming majority of the world right now does not want camps to be created, does not want to be in one or the other camp, because unlike the Cold War, you've got to understand there's one big difference between the Cold War and today. In the Cold War, there's a group called the non-aligned movement. It's, of course, very debatable how non-aligned they were, but the signal was we've got to stay out of this. Today, because of global integration, economic integration, and the level of the economic integration, countries don't, the countries that I call, frankly, middle powers or the third bloc, don't have the option of giving up on one big player and joining hands with the other. It's going to be a lose-lose situation for them. So I do think there are real reasons why everybody can find ways to compete while keeping cooperation at the center of the relationship. But when I look at the conversation and the narratives, for instance, in the big capitals, I find a very serious security dilemma that sort of come into the mind. It's more psychological than anything else, whereby both, I think, China and US feel that they understand each other. Both feel that the other is making it competitive and coming after their interests. And there are these blind spots that are developed over time now, and it's very difficult to pull it back. But if you were in a third capital, a country that's not directly involved in that, you can very clearly see that there are still a number of avenues for very healthy cooperation, which are being foregone now because of the mindset of increasing competition, wanting a first mover's advantage, assuming the worst of the rival or the competitor. And that's a classic security dilemma. So I'm very worried that this great power competition is going to drive other countries to have to pick camps, and you'll end up with a polarized world in 2 or whatever number of camps where you're going to have a very, very competitive streak. The other thing, Usama, I mentioned on your program before, I think I'll say it again. Instead of the Iron Curtain, you're now moving to a technology curtain. And this current phase or the next phase of great power competition, you're going to have the first victim is going to be technology, which actually, if shared with the entire world, is going to raise people out of poverty and give them far more opportunities of vertical mobility. But what you're going to see, I think, is a technology curtain. If you're in the Chinese, on the Chinese side of the curtain, then that's all you get. If you're on the Western side of the curtain, that's all you get. And it's fairly tragic for the overwhelming majority of the world that still lives in deprivation.
All right, Josh, now let me try and redraw your attention to this recent write-up, which was written by Michael Beckley for the Foreign Affairs, titled Delusions in Detente, where he makes a case for containment over engagement with China. Josh, you too have made a case for the US to protect its technology and work with allies to reduce dependence on China's economy. How do you think prescriptions like these will not be seen by China as upping the ante and possibly throwing both the US and China into an endless cycle of tit-for-tat actions?
Right. I think it's an excellent question because, when I hear Dr. Yusuf talk about the need to cooperate and to engage at the same time, this is something I hear a lot in my travels, especially in Asia. And it strikes me that that's precisely, in fact, the Biden administration's policy, which they announced and made clear to the Chinese government from the get-go. You could call it engagement, containment plus engagement. In other words, we compete with you and we leave the door open and actually encourage U.S.-China cooperation on all the areas where we have overlapping interests. The problem with that is not on the U.S. side. Beijing has rejected that approach repeatedly in public and in private, and as recently as last week, but starting in March of 2021, they don't want to do it. Okay, and we have to be honest about that because, and here's the evidence. Just in the last 4 months, we've had 5 senior U.S. Officials visit Beijing: Janet Yellen, Tony Blinken, Bill Burns, the CIA director, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of the Commerce, and climate envoy John Kerry, with zero reciprocation, zero signals that China is willing to re-engage on any of these issues. The climate change cooperation, which should be the lowest bar, right? If we can't cooperate on climate change, if we can't agree that we all have an interest in saving the planet, that was cut off by the Chinese government over Taiwan a year ago, and they still haven't really turned that back on in any serious way. So we have to just be honest about the fact that it takes 2 to tango, as we say in the United States. And the Biden administration has been going out of its way, actually at a political cost, to keep the engagement, to push the engagement track. They've gotten zero reciprocation. When our defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, was in the same room as the Chinese defense minister, the Chinese wouldn't meet with him. So what kind of engagement there are we really talking about? And when in general, I totally agree with Dr. Yusuf that we have a problem of a trust deficit between U.S. and China. And I agree with the premise of your question that there's a risk of an escalation ladder. But I don't think anyone is suggesting that we should completely ignore all of these problems that not in the U.S.-China relationship, but that are in China's relationships with a lot of other countries around the world. And if it was just the United States concerned about these things, then I would say, sure, maybe we're, entering a tit for tat, but it's not. And we see all over the world that China's increasing military expansion, economic coercion, is turning populaces and therefore governments against them. And I could point to Lithuania, I could point to things that have happened in Australia, I could point to what's going on in the Philippines, just to name a few. And so I think that we have to be honest and clear-eyed about the fact that, and this is not about the United States, this is about the international response to China's behavior as it rises. And of course, we don't want to suppress the Chinese economy, but we also can't tolerate massive economic aggression and economic coercion and military expansion and a genocide against Uyghur Muslims and lots of these other things that in democracies we just can't ignore. We can't just turn away from. And I think we should leave the door open for the Chinese Communist Party to re-engage with both Washington and a lot of other countries that are desperate for such engagement, and not just on the economics, but on all of these other issues. But there's something going on in Beijing right now that we can't really understand. And there's something going on internally in the CCP that we can't really understand. And so yes, you're right that there's a risk, but it's going to take 2 sides to avoid that escalation ladder. And just ignoring the problems with China's actions is not an option.
All right, Moeed, do you want to chip in and add something to it?
Sure. Look, I think Josh has thrown everything in the kitchen sink in there. The point is the following. This argument, I'm not debating the merits of it, but this argument or the package that Josh has sort of thrown in there is exactly the reason that makes me very worried. Because if that's representing Washington's view, I'll get the exact same mirror image, polar opposite argument from Beijing. And I'm not in a position to decide who's right, who's wrong. And frankly, it's not for the third bloc to be too concerned about the right or wrong here. But I'm not speaking from either Washington or Beijing's perspective. If I were, I'd talk a slightly different language. But here's the point. The point is that there's a large number of these countries who are not important enough on their own, but collectively actually wield a lot of leverage and clout, have a lot of people who live in these countries, have a lot at stake in ensuring cooperation, who directly hurt because of these mindsets, right? That's, I think, the conversation from a third-party perspective that I'm most worried about. And frankly, 99% of the world minus the big players and their allies are worried about. Think about a country like Pakistan. So if I had a Chinese guest with me, I'd make the opposite argument. But since Josh is here, let me say this. So US Congress passed some kind of bill or resolution or whatever at some point that projects with Chinese technology, if they're getting US public money, they can't be used in certain ways. I don't exactly know what the language is. So now let's come to Pakistan. If you have Chinese technology, you are unable to get that support from US public monies. Okay. What is the definition of technology? When somebody was asked this question, the answer was technology. And so every office in Pakistan has a Huawei router. Not because I love Huawei as a company, but because it's 1/10 the price of any other router that I get in the market, right? Now, does that count or doesn't count? What happens in bureaucracies is that people shy away and they don't want to make these decisions. And thus, you start losing out partners because of these kind of situations. So when you ask Washington and Beijing, they'll tell you we're not asking any country to make a choice. But from a third country perspective, I would argue what else is a choice? If that is not a choice, then what is a choice? Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific as the US calls it. Pakistan is not part of that. India is a big champion of that. Okay, understood. Military alliance, Pakistan is not going to be part of that. We understand that. Why isn't Pakistan part of that economic framework? Well, because, you're not on the right side of this. So, and I could quote you similar examples if I were to talk of the other big player. What I'm saying is not that Josh is right or wrong. My problem is that these mindsets are basically forcing countries into a corner. And if they are asked to make a choice, both big powers will lose out, as will the world. That's, I think, the conversation to have. And who's more right than the other? Frankly, from the third block perspective right now, it's an existential issue. So we are less worried about that and more worried about the fact that we are unable to convince the big players to find ways to cooperate. That's basically how I would come at it.
Dr. Moeed, I had another question. Pakistan came up with its Vision East Asia policy. Where do you rate Pakistan's success on it? Dr. Moeed, could you really throw some light on that? If it has not been a success, what exactly are the reasons? And could it really be executed differently? And what would be needed for that?
I don't think it's really taken off, Usama. Look, the point is, it's the right thing to do. We have to find new markets. And we also had an Africa focus, at least when I was in government, East Asia, Central Asia, connectivity, because of the national security sort of policy and the whole idea of economic security. But the issue is the following. You've got to create those structures that will then bolster your capacity to compete. If economic diplomacy is not your strong suit, it's going to be very difficult to penetrate these kind of markets and spaces. One of the big challenges for Pakistan is that we are not part of many potent and vibrant regional trading and investment blocks. So if you're not going to be part of that, automatically you're at a disadvantage because the products or the services you are providing come up across or against a different tariff wall than members of that group. So at the end of the day, I think we have to first expand those partnerships. That requires two things. Requires competitive products and requires a whole machinery of economic diplomacy that's pushing with a singular mission, opening up new markets and new opportunities for Pakistan in the economic domain. Unless we do that, I can, come up with, look East Asia, look Africa, look Central Asia, look Timbuktu, but it's going to have a marginal impact. The other problem, of course, is because of our relationship with India, and frankly, India's odd, irrational intransigence, at least when I was in government, the eastern flank, immediate eastern flank is closed. And so, that also is a problem if you want to link up east. But again, there are serious issues there. And I think New Delhi has to think about those if we really want to move forward. But that said, at the end of the day, we do have to branch out and look for those things. But we have to make sure that the domestic prerequisites for those things to work out have to be in place.
And what might the domestic prerequisites look like to you?
To create competitive products and services, there's a whole value and supply chain behind it, right? You've got to invest in the right sectors. The government has to put the right incentives. The ease of doing business has to be there. Taxation system has to be fair. And you have to motivate your producers and your service providers to actually focus on certain markets where Pakistan wants to grow. You've got to identify the right sectors and then prioritize those. You've got to bring in FDI into those sectors for re-export. I mean, there's a whole chain. There's no rocket science. The world has done it. Many countries have done it. We've done it in some sectors, but we haven't done it enough times for long enough to make it a sustained effort to increase our exports and services in these new markets. And of course, as I said, if you're not part of the trading bloc, you're entering it with a disadvantage. So you've got to reverse that through competition, and that's where we've lacked.
Josh, let me draw your attention to a recent interview you did with Vice President Kamala Haris on a recent trip to Jakarta, where she attended an ASEAN meeting. You mentioned in that piece that Southeast Asian countries are reluctant to pick sides between the US and China, notwithstanding the United States' 5 treaty allies are in Asia. Do you think greater investment of resources by the US will mean forcing regional states to pick sides between the US or China, or the states will continue to have that liberty?
Yeah, excellent question. So I was in Jakarta with Vice President Harris, and I attended the U.S. ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit, and had a chance to meet with some of my friends and also officials in the region. And, I have to say that, I don't see anyone in the U.S. system on any side saying that any of these countries have to choose between the U.S. and China. In fact, the Biden administration says at every single opportunity that the United States does not want to be in the position of putting these countries where they have to choose between the United States and China. At the same time, I understand that a lot of our U.S. policies do affect these third countries, and a lot of Chinese policies do affect these third countries. My criticism, because I'm not here to defend the Biden administration or Washington in general, I'm here to explain it to your readers and give my analysis. And my criticism has always been that the United States has neglected all of these other countries in the world and focused too much on main powers. And this is not both Democrats and Republicans, frankly. And, look at the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I mean, what in any sane world would be one of the most important bilateral relationships out there, major non-NATO ally, by the way, and very much neglected in Washington. This is something that me and Dr. Yusuf have talked about before. And why is that? It's because Washington policymaking is very concentrated in the hands of a few people who have a few narrow ideas about what it really means to engage the world. And because Congress doesn't have a strong Pakistan constituency built into it, and because we don't have a strong economic plank to our Asia strategy, or to our South Asia strategy especially. And it seems clear to me that what most of first of all, that all the countries in ASEAN are all different and need to be, and all the country. And so, when I look at sort of an expanded BRICS or a reconstitution of the non-aligned movement, I don't think it's fair to say that all these countries act together. I think that they all need to be approached with a lot of nuance and individuality. But that being said, I think what they're all calling for is more economic engagement and less military tensions. And I think there's a really useful way for the United States to do that if we could get our act together. But no, I don't think anyone in Washington wants to put these countries in a position to choose. And when it comes to things like Huawei, yeah, I think that a lot of the technology restrictions that we're placing on China are not done perfectly, because it's a new type of policy that the U.S. government is not used to. It's never been tried before. And sometimes there's overreach, and sometimes it doesn't work the way you want it to work. And sometimes it backfires, and sometimes it has real costs. And I think the semiconductor debate that's going on is a huge part of this. We spent $250 billion to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the United States. And it was just a really crazy and problematic process because we don't have an understanding of what technologies we need to protect, what technologies we don't need to protect, and how best to do that in a globalized world. But, I would just say to any listener in Pakistan or a country that's feeling like they're being forced to choose between the United States and China, who's the one really putting you to that choice? And my last point would be, I find, especially, regarding, this is my opinion now, regarding, for example, the situation in Ukraine, that you have a lot of countries, middle powers, whatever you want to call them, who are free riders on an international system that they benefit from, but are not willing to defend when it's under threat. And I'm not singling out Pakistan. I'm not singling out any country. I'm just saying that, there's a big power competition right now between NATO and Russia, and Ukrainians are suffering the most. But there are a lot of countries out there that are sitting this one out, and I think they see that as in their self-interest. But I would just argue that the rules and norms and order and stability that is being threatened by things like Russian attack on Ukraine impact all of these other countries, and especially in the global South, very deeply. And I regret that they're often put themselves in the position of saying, well, we're not on either side, and we're just suffering, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's a lot they can do about it, and I wish they would do more. And I'll stop there.
Josh, what might look to you like, from an American perspective, an economic footprint of the United States that is more invested in the region of Southeast Asia, and also to some extent in a country like Pakistan as well?
Right. No, I think the problem is not the level of investment. I think U.S., especially foreign direct investment especially in Southeast Asia, is very, very high. In fact, higher than China in some cases, in certain countries, and definitely higher than U.S. investment in China. So if you think about it, we actually have more invested in Southeast Asia than we do in China by far. But that's not the way we think about it in our politics, because that's not the way our foreign policy establishment is organized. But I think a more robust strategy would include real trade deals. Okay, and that's politically impossible, but for either party right now, because of the dysfunction again in U.S. politics. But yeah, there's a lot of these countries want U.S. market access. The United States wants to de-risk, which means moving some manufacturing supply lines out of China. South Asia is a natural place for that. And you see them talk about that a lot, but you don't see them doing it a lot. And what I'm saying is that if we had a comprehensive, robust, credible economic and investment strategy in South Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa and South America, for that matter, and the Middle East and lots of other places that aren't big power countries like Russia and China, these countries would have a better choice. They would be able to compare that based on their own self-interest with whatever the Chinese government is offering in terms of Belt and Road, in terms of investment, in terms of what they're going to do when they come into your country with their projects, and what that's going to mean for your workforce, what that's going to mean for your economy, what that's going to mean for your environment. And I do think that we could offer a better option, not to force them to choose, but to offer them a choice, not on strategic alignment, but on what kind of economic future do these countries want? So I get that's a little complicated. In other words, we're not forcing countries into a choice. We're going to give them options. We should give them options. We should give a lot of countries a lot of options, and we're not doing it. And I think that redounds to Beijing's benefit. But at the same time, to be honest, we have to be clear-eyed about what's going on in China, which is a government crackdown on the private sector, and a government crackdown on international business, and raiding international businesses, and arresting foreign businessmen, and basically cracking down on their own businessmen at the same time. And I think this is making China less attractive as both an investor and as a destination for investment. And not just the United States, but there are a lot of countries, including Pakistan, that could take advantage of that if we had a more nimble approach to how to cooperate economically within the constraints of each country's respective politics.
Dr. Moeed, before I move forward, do you have something to contribute over here?
Yeah, I guess I'll say two things. One, I've had this struggle with all my friends from the US and Europe since the Ukraine war began. Because you remember the famous, infamous headlines around Pakistan because of Pakistan's official sort of visit to Russia on the day of the invasion, which frankly had nothing to do with Ukraine or the war. But in any case, and the struggle is that there is this, and I think this is, Josh, for your understanding, not again for right or wrong. I think it comes across, and I can understand your point of view, having lived in the town you're in for, for so long, and understanding the system and everything. But most people in this part of the world will not understand this. It comes across as if there is an imperial thought behind, now that the war has hit my hemisphere, you must understand that this is the make or break for the world and the global system. While every other war that was happening in your neighborhood and with your people and issues that you thought were existential were really not that important. So again, I think this has to be understood, that what may be a life and death moment for you, Pakistan has actually struggled and suffered because of the commodity prices, energy prices that have gone up because of the war, right? So it's not that we're sitting by the side and watching, we're actually reeling. And that's why our entire argument was we want the war to end, and then we can decide who wins and who loses, right? And of course, all countries look at these things in self-interest. I don't want to talk about India's role because frankly, it's embarrassed much of the Western world, given where, the darling counterweight to China and what really has come off it. But leave that aside. I think that the point to understand is one can't impose a view on others who have a very different view of that situation. So, and I will say, which I used to say many times when I was still in Washington, that the wars that the US led in the last 20 years have really damaged that credibility of the global system in the minds of people in this part of the world. Again, not making a judgment call, but Iraq, for instance, I think is a big mark on many in this part of the world. And anytime you talk, they say, well, Afghanistan or Iraq, or for Pakistan, for instance, Kashmir. And so not justifying. All I'm saying is there are two ways to look at this. But many people react negatively when they hear that, oh, so this was the real war, we must have gotten our act together on, and the rest is all not important. So I'm not saying you're saying that, but I think that's really, I'm trying to explain how people react to that. The other part of this, yes, I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of the economic space. Countries like Pakistan, look, you have to understand the dilemma. Overwhelming majority of our economic input comes from China, and the output goes to the West. So what kind of choice can I make? That's, I think, the struggle.
And also, Josh, when you speak to regional country representatives, they emphasize the use of ASEAN as a forum for dialogue between the United States and China. How helpful could this be in reducing or managing tensions over there?
Yeah, no, first of all, I want to just say that I agree with Dr. Yusuf that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was not only a mistake, but a tragic one, and that damaged U.S. credibility for a generation. And I find that to be very sad for my country, not to mention the people of Iraq. So I want to be clear that I agree with you on that. But I think it's important to make a distinction between that and this, because this is not an example of American imperialism. This is a direct example of Russian imperialism. Russia attacked Ukraine. An aggressor country attacked a weaker country with no justification and committed mass atrocities. And so I think the consistent position is to be against any illegal invasions and to be against this one, rather than to say that America is leading the Ukraine war. And it's not in our hemisphere, by the way. It's in a completely different hemisphere. So we're actually going out of our way to help the Ukrainians. And Josh, it's very controversial here as well. So I think I take your overall point, which is that U.S. credibility in the region is low. But I think, as you acknowledge, Pakistan does have a big interest in who wins, or not who wins, but in preserving Ukrainian sovereignty and economy and success.
Yeah, no.
Being neutral is sort of, I think, a missed opportunity for Pakistan to defend its interests, which are actually, again, not to preach about your interest to you, are in resisting these kinds of horrendous aggressions, full stop.
Well, I mean, look, I'd say this again. Nobody's saying about this war that the US has, waged the war, or, I mean, when I say hemisphere, it's basically talking about Europe, essentially, but, NATO is there. That's not the point. The point is, when you make this argument that it's about Russian imperialism, it's Russia that's gone in and done that, for many in this part of the world, Iraq is no different. I'm not getting into the legality or the question or whatever. You have asked, I mean, the conversation we're having basically is, why are people sitting on the fence? And what I'm saying is that credibility gap is why people are sitting on the fence. That I think is a bigger factor than most in the West have understood it to be. That's basically the argument. Other than that, of course, Pakistan's constantly and has said sovereignty of countries has to be respected according to UN principles. That's what we've talked again and again. And so our point is, we are not in a position to fight a war, and we don't want to fight a war. We've been saying from day one, we need to end this conflict, UN principles again, UN charter, and make sure that nobody else is hurting. And that's why it's very consistent with our positions. On a disputed territory of Kashmir, for instance, that's our argument. It is about a sovereign territory that I claim and nobody else. So, I mean, I think the point is not where Pakistan is or where US is or where Russia is or whatever. The point is the psyche of people, I think, has been misunderstood in the West, and why people are sitting on the fence. It's not a pro-Russia stance. That's all I'm saying.
I'm sure that's the case. I understand it. Let me answer your direct question, which is, can forums like ASEAN and other pave the conditions for U.S.-China engagement? And I think they can. And I think in previous instances, they often have. And I think there are many examples, even during the Trump administration, where at various meetings like the G20, President Trump and President Xi Jinping got a lot of business done, and met and spent a lot of time. And I think the problem, again, right now, just to be factual and to be perfectly honest, is not on the U.S. side. Let me repeat. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin went to the Shangri-La dialogue, flew literally across the world, sat in the same room as the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu, and they wouldn't meet with him. They wouldn't talk. They met with everybody else, but they wouldn't meet with the U.S. Defense Secretary. So we just have to be honest and clear that the lack of more engagement right now objectively is the fault of the Chinese side. And what's going to happen when Joe Biden is no longer president, and who knows if it'll be a year from now or 5 years from now, but someday he won't be president. We'll have perhaps a much more hawkish president on China who won't want to engage with the Chinese. And what they're going to do is they're going to point back to this time and saying, look, we tried, and there was no reciprocation from Beijing. So yeah, I think third countries can play a role in bringing the U.S. and China to better outcomes. But again, if China won't sit down, then there's very little that we can do. But leave the door open.
Josh, you have been in the media business for too long now. Tell us, how is the state of press freedom in the United States? It is often cited in Pakistan as an example that it is not directed. How does the media really operate over there?
Right. It's a great question. And I'll be completely honest with you. That I've spent 20 years as a journalist in Washington, D.C. And, I think I have a pretty good read on our media environment and our media business. And, I think that there are a couple of really important things to understand. One is that, the media in the mainstream media, at least in my experience, there's no evidence that they're directed by the government, but they are sometimes captured by their sources. In other words, it's not an explicit direction. There's no explicit co-option, but individual people in these situations are human beings and can sometimes get too close to their sources. And because the media is made up of human beings, and because the government is made up of human beings, there are sometimes some of these people can be unethical, some of them can be bad, some of them can do things between the government and media that are not pure in the journalistic integrity sense. For sure, those things, you can find those examples. But I'm here to tell you that the vast, vast majority of journalists, even in Washington, even today, are honest, hardworking people trying to get it right, and are trying to be honest with their readers while dealing with their sources from a position of professional antagonism. We should be, in a sense, pushing back against the government, being skeptical of what they say, and investigating their actions when they don't match their words. That's how I see my role as a journalist. And I'm not perfect either. I'm not saying I haven't made mistakes, but I think what's attributed both in Washington and around America and around the world to some sort of collusion between Washington media and government is really just, a bunch of human beings interacting with each other in a very complicated and high pressure situation. And sometimes these human beings can make bad decisions, and those get blown out of proportion. Now, that's the first point. I think most U.S. journalists are doing the right thing the right way. The vast majority, I would say 90%. And I'm making up that number, but you get my drift. Okay. Then the second point is that what we define as the media in America has changed a lot in the 20 years since I started in this business. And actually, what the mainstream media, Washington Post, CNN, except New York Times, Wall Street Journal, that's a very small portion right now of our information environment. And readers and listeners are spreading out to other parts of the information ecosystem. And it started with YouTube and TikTok, but it's podcasts, and it's virtual reality, and it's social media. And so the way that Americans get their news, the entire thing of the Washington media establishment is a very small fraction of that. And I think the problem is that other huge part of the U.S. Information, there's no checks and checks and balances on that part. And actually, the mainstream media is held up to a lot of scrutiny, so we actually have to, and I as we should be, by the way. But the sort of fringe media and the alt-right media and the anti-establishment media, there's no one fact checking them, so they're putting a lot of disinformation into the public space that has a really terrible effect on our culture and our society and our politics. It's not to say that independent media is bad. Quite the contrary. I think it's good, but it's also the wild, wild west. And that's the problem, is that normal people in America don't know what to believe. But I'm here to tell you that if you think that like the U.S. media is like, the mainstream media is sort of like working with the CIA or the government, or that I get a call from Jeff Bezos or General Electric to tell me what to write, that's nonsense. That's ridiculous. That really doesn't happen. Nevertheless, there are examples, not by me, of corruptions that are legitimate examples that need to be dealt with.
All right, Dr. Moeed, now let me rope you in over here. Tell us, what really prompted you to start and be part of something as Infer? You've come from a think tank / policymaking background. What do you seek to achieve through something like Infer?
I think the appreciation of the importance of communication in today's world. Simple. Policy without communication, and I don't want to call it marketing, but policy without communication is no good in today's world. This is not the world of press releases. This is not the world of comma here and a full stop there. Yes, all State Departments and foreign offices do that. I mean, that's part of their job. But really, the influencing of conversations and minds is not happening in such a archaic way. It's really live, it's real, and it's about debate and conversation and views. Pakistan, I felt, frankly, did a lot of talking to itself. 100 channels or whatever they are, Urdu language. There is no platform where Pakistan is able to speak to the world. And by Pakistan, I don't mean the Pakistani state at all. I mean different views from Pakistan getting to the world about global and Pakistani issues that matter. That's the idea. So when Pakistanis, we all crib about the fact that our perception is very negative. The West has unfairly treated us as a dangerous country and all of that. The question I always ask is, what have we done to explain to the world why they're wrong? And the answer is, well, we have 50, 100, whatever news channels. Well, sorry, those news channels are insufferable even when you and I watch them in the evening. right? That's not what you want to sell to the world if you are trying to project that there are certain things you're getting right. And in that case, if there are embassies sitting in Islamabad watching Pakistan and sending cables back to their countries or their capitals, what do they go by? That's the conversation that we need to be having in an educated, informed, objective way. No party line, no selling, any particular view, but leaving views open. And so Josh is sitting here talking to you right now. What is happening? He's getting a viewpoint. He's giving you a viewpoint. And everybody from Pakistani diaspora to Pakistanis who speak English here to the international audience will get information, and then they can make up their own mind. At least you're having a conversation that is not all the time about terrorism, how much terrorism, good terrorism, bad terrorism, because you know, and I know, and Josh knows, that's not Pakistan. There are 250 million people, and that's not what we do for a living. So that's what motivated me to set up something. This is not about ratings or revenue or anything like that. The idea was just to open up a platform where we could have very informed discussions. Josh is sitting here. Tomorrow, you're going to have somebody from China sitting, and we'll have a very different conversation, because the idea is to challenge, not to prove or disprove.
Now, Josh, let me come back to you. You've interviewed multiple of the who and who of the world, including the heads of state, such as Vice President Kamala Haris, Mike Pence, and Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. How does an interview like this really come about? What is it that is going on behind the scenes that makes something like this happen? And then also, how do you prepare for such an interview to try to make it good and not just boring stuff?
Sure. Well, you left one prominent senior official off that list, the National Security Advisor of Pakistan, Dr. Yusuf, who I interviewed when he was in a position of service and leadership. So, let's not give Pakistan short shrift in that.
George, he's only talking about important people, not important portfolios.
You're so modest. But it's an interesting question. In my experience, the opportunity for an interview with any of the people who are heads of state, heads of government level, masters of the universe kind of elite interviews, they tend to come together at the opportunities that those leaders decide that they want to speak to an American audience. And so that's the timing of it. They don't do interviews for no reason. They do it when, for example, if they're going to come to the United States and to Washington. This was the example with Prime Minister Kishida. He was on his way to a state visit with President Biden. So before he gets to Washington, he wants to explain to Americans what it's all about. That was how that came about. Same thing with Vice President Harris, right? She's been vice president for 2.5 years. She never gave me an interview before, but now she's going to Southeast Asia rather, and she has an interest in having the world know about that and what she thinks about it. And so they brought me along. So that's the first condition, is that the timing has to be dictated by the leader's side, but then the terms have to be negotiated toughly. And this is the second out of three things I'll say. That less in America, but not, to be honest, the White House does this too. But in many countries, what these leaders try to do is they try to set up an interview with steep conditions. You can't ask me about that. You should ask me about this. I want to know the questions in advance. And one of the most important things I do is to reject all of those conditions and negotiate terms because if you agree to those conditions, the interview is going to be terrible. And you're just getting a press release, and there's no reason for the journalist to be in the room if they just want to say what they want to say. And I don't believe in giving my platform and my reputation and my credibility to a piece of journalism that was dictated by the interview subject. So it's really important for journalists in these situations. And it's tough because it's a really cool interview. You really want to do it. Your boss is going to be happy if you do it, but you can't compromise on this basic tenet, which is that you have to have independence as a journalist in the interview. And I'm not going to name the country, but I will say that I was supposed to interview a prime minister at ASEAN. I'm not going to tell you which one. And they said, oh, well, you can't ask him about China. And I said, well, I have to ask him about China. And they said, next day I got an email and they said the interview was canceled. So that's a price that I'm willing to pay. I'd rather do I'd rather do a no interview than a bad interview. And then the third thing I'll say is that because these leaders have massive staffs full of people who are trying to manage every word that comes out of their mouth, because when a head of state or head of government or something like that says anything, it has a big influence and impact. So they've got 100 people trying to say this, don't say that. This is all you can say. This is what you can't say. And they'll be overbriefed, and they'll be so careful. And that's death for a good interview. So my strategy, this is just my personal tip to any journalists out there, is to overdo the research. And that's what I try to do. I try to research it so much that I end up asking them questions that they didn't prepare for and that their staff didn't anticipate. There's some that you have to ask that they're going to give you the stock answers. But if you can learn about what makes them tick, if you can learn about their history and their personality and maybe something about their life and their family and their upbringing or their culture, and get them to put down that briefing book. There's always a moment in that senior interview where the official is looking at his notes, and then you ask him something and he thinks, oh my God, I never thought of that before. And he puts the book down. Now you're having a real interview. That's when things start to get fun. That's when a senior, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes they never put it down, but if you can get them to put the book down, you're going to produce a piece of journalism that's of a lot more value, both to the official, I would argue, although their staff may not think that way, but to your readers as well.
Dr. Moeed, we've heard Josh's perspective from someone who conducts interviews and what really goes into it. Now, let me ask you from the perspective of someone who gives interviews. One of your claims to fame was giving interviews to Karan Thapar on The Wire and with Stephen Sacker on the Hard Talk on BBC. From the perspective of an interviewee, how have you managed to hold your ground in the face of persistent and difficult questions?
I know people think that, and a lot of people, and I'm very grateful to people who keep remembering and recalling and keep telling me that, not multiple interviews that I did. I hope my real claim to fame is not the interviews, but the real work we did in the office. But that's on a lighter note. It's actually quite fascinating to hear Josh, because, for the most part, I am on the other side of the table. And it's a peek into what Josh would do if he wants to speak to me. So I'll give you the other side. The first part, Usama, and I think overwhelming majority of Pakistani interviewees that I have seen, officials especially, fail in this, is they're not prepared. They go in with this bit of a I'll wing it superiority complex. And if you get a really good interviewer, which is, who are the only ones you should talk to, frankly, they're going to be prepared. So if you walk into that room thinking I'm just going to find my way out of this somehow, you're going to be massacred. So first of all, you actually, Josh is saying over-research. I also over-research, right? What is this guy? Why is this guy talking to me? What would he want to get out of me? How do I not go where I don't want to go as an official? And that's a constraint every official lives with. And then within that space, I have to anticipate every single angle that this person may come up with. And if I'm not talking one day, I'm talking a week, 2 weeks. Of course, as NSA or whatever, you have teams. So it's not like you are doing that. But you have to take this as a serious project, because you are defending the position of your country. I couldn't care less if Moeed Yusuf was massacred in an interview. But when the Pakistani National Security Advisor is massacred, I've just hurt my country. Right? So that's one. You've got to be over-prepared and take this seriously. The second one is, you will almost always have to keep the book down, as Josh says, if you don't believe in the story you are communicating. Officials almost never can speak the whole truth in every interview, but you should never speak anything but the truth in terms of what that conversation is, right? Now, the point is, if you are not convinced about your story, then you can't convince your audience about the story. And there, I think, again, is a weakness I've found mostly. If you're not prepared and you feel that your story is weak, it's more psychological than anything else. You haven't looked at the angles that make sense to you, and you're not sort of clear enough to put them across. Again, you're going to be on the back foot. Look, this is not performance. This is really exchange of content which is substantive. So I think you have to be prepared and you have to know what you want to put across. And the third point is you've got to be bold. You can't be cowed down because the opposite number is a trained interviewer and obviously has more professional expertise in that than you do as an official. And you've just got to make sure that you get this right. So all interviewers who are good would have actually looked at multiple interviews that you have done. They'll know where your weakness is. It's almost like sports, like, they'll analyze you before they come in, and you've got to know exactly how to situate yourself. And the final point I'll make is, I have a standard rule, and this may surprise many. I refuse to ask or look at questions before I do an interview. I think that's the worst thing you can do. That shows deep insecurity on the part of the interviewee. But more importantly, what it does is it boxes your mind into those questions. And then anything outside of that, you're completely stumped. So, all these interviews, you can go back. I mean, you've mentioned two, but, there were others, of course. You can go back to the interviewers and ask them. And even when they said, we'll share a set of questions or we'll tell you the themes, I, as a rule, refuse. I never want to see what they're going to ask me. I should be prepared myself.
All right, gentlemen, before we go ahead and wrap up our conversation, Dr. Moeed, you're a Vice Chancellor of the Beaconhouse National University, and your university also has a program for journalism and media studies. Where do you think the role of experience of people like yourself and Josh can be helpful in preparing world-class journalists in a university like this? And Josh, how could you contribute to young minds from this part of the world venturing into a career like this?
I'd say two things. As somebody who's sort of overseeing the university now, especially in the journalism and mass communication space. Number one, no matter how much exposure you get from the internet and all of that, best practices are not necessarily easy for students to glean from across the world, especially in languages that they don't understand or in systems that they're not acquainted to. So one of the things I would do with Josh, actually I am going to do with Josh hopefully at some point, is ask him to come on and give online lectures to the students, 2 or 3 lectures on different aspects of what it feels to be and means to be a journalism in the field and how you do it and whatever. It's a practitioner's view essentially at the end of the day, right? What are the best practices that he wants to inculcate in minds of students across the world? That's one. The second one, I think, is perhaps even more important. I want him to, or I want somebody like Josh to explain to students, how do you sift through volumes of information and pass out the nonsense from the real stuff, right? This is, I think, the biggest challenge of absorbing information today for every human being. But if you're a journalist, it's your profession. So you've got to be very careful not to be carried away, by a particular set of information sources that are self-selected because they suit your view. That, I think, would be something that I think Josh and others could help my students with. My students, frankly, could also help Josh by explaining the context in which they operate, which may be very different than what Josh may see, right? So there is a win-win here, and it's simply called academia-industry linkage. They're very weak usually across the world, and I would want to build on that.
Josh.
Sure. Well, I think, what Dr. Yusuf is pointing to is the need for media literacy, which is desperately, desperately needed here in the United States. And we have to make that an important part of our culture and our education. And that's not to favor one side or the other. It's to help people do that exact task of sifting through just an enormous amount of information and being able to judge for themselves. Because right now it's too hard. It's too hard for most people to climb that hill to get to the top, to understand and research whether or not the information they're getting from any one source is accurate or credible or fair. So and to be honest, I think that's something that I should devote more time to, and I'm happy to participate in, especially in programs in Pakistan. Of course, I'd jump at the chance for that. At the same time, I would ask you to understand that when I engage American audiences or Chinese audiences or Pakistani audiences or Indonesian audiences. I don't censor myself. Okay. I speak honestly. I know the bounds of what I can say with confidence and credibility. And part of that is to defend press freedom around the world. And at the same time, we all have to do better. And we have to understand that things like overuse of defamation laws, lack of protection for whistleblowers, barriers to information access, and constraints caused by public and government hostility to journalists is something that we all need to work on.
Dr. Moeed, Josh, thank you for joining us on InferTalks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this, my friend.
Awesome.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Dr. Moeed Yusuf and Josh Rogin. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you'd like to stay informed on upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.